Hi everyone, and welcome to Chapter 35. So we're getting closer and closer to the end of this course. Today we focus on neurons in the nervous system, and you'll notice that this is one of the slightly more complicated chapters that we cover, so I make sure to put extra recap note slides throughout where I basically give you a chance to pause and jot down almost a word for word on some of the slides, transcript of what I had said, because some of the terminology used is a little tougher to jot down as you're taking notes. Also, I like the picture on this slide because now every time you blush, you will think of your stomach lining also turning red thanks to the increased blood flow everywhere in your body, which we're going to cover throughout today's slides. Now, before we get to, the important ones, which is us, the humans, we got to talk about some of the other organisms' nervous system organizations. And here you see a few different types of creatures that have very interesting nervous systems that are considered to be a bit simpler compared to us in some cases. So the first one over here, this is a hydra. And hydras, they lack a true brain the way that we have. Instead, they have a system of separate but connected nerve cells called neurons, which you're going to see in our nervous system as well. And their network of neurons form what's called a nerve net instead of having a brain. And the nerve net is basically just all these neurons in contact with each other, having some contractile epithelial, what they call epithelial muscular cells involved as well. But they don't have an actual brain the way that we do. Instead, it's a nerve net of just neurons with some muscles mixed in. The next one here that we have mentioned is planaria, which you've seen before. They're flatworms, and they have what's called ladder-like cephalization. And whenever you hear cephalization, basically that means an organization or a collection of structures in a head-like form. Okay, so when you hear, for instance, encephalitis, that's inflammation or infection of the brain, which is in your head. So whenever you hear cephalo, think head and brain. So planarias, what they have is this ladder-like concentration of what's called ganglia and sensory receptors in their head, but again, it's not a true brain structure. Whereas the last group that we have of invertebrates here, annelids, arthropods, and mollusks, these guys, they're more complex animals, and they're considered to have a true nervous system similar to what you would find in vertebrates. And when we say vertebrates, we include humans. So any of those last ones, the annelids, the arthropods, and the mollusks, they're going to have very similar structures to us in that they will have a brain and they will have nerves. So I want you to circle star highlight annelids, arthropods, and mollusks to remind yourself that those creatures will have a brain, whereas the other ones mentioned before that will not. And when you see those terms, in case you're not sure what they are, annelids are things such as earthworms, arthropods are insects, and mollusks are things such as snails. So those are to kind of help you visualize what organisms I mean. Here you have your recap notes to jot down some of the information that I just mentioned. And now we're going to start moving on, like I said, to the more important organisms, which we always say are humans and us, and we are vertebrates. And so the way that we're organized is through cephalization and bilateral symmetry. So what that means is, again, cephalization, think of encephalitis, where you hear of inflammation of the brain, right? So cephalization is when you have a concentration of sense organisms or nervous control into a brain or head structure, okay? And then bilateral symmetry that we have, that basically means that it's something that can be cut in half so that there's a left and a right side pair that match each other. Okay, so cephalization means we have the brain and head-like structure, and bilateral symmetry means you can cut our brain in half to have a left side and match side that match each other. So what we have is a central nervous system, and anytime you hear central nervous system, I want you to know that that is your spinal cord and your brain. So circle, star, highlight, spinal cord and brain is what we mean by central nervous system. You also have several paired sensory receptors. So that means you have a bunch of receptors that allow you to feel sensations, to bring electrical signals to your brain. So for instance, when you feel that something's hot and you get burned, when you feel pain, that's thanks to having sensory receptors. Now, when we say brain, we have 3 parts to the brain. It's organized into the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain. So you see that here, forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. Okay, so front to back. And when we talk about these brain-like structures in the nervous system, I want you to know what their functions are. So your nervous system has 3 main functions. First of all, it's responsible for you being able to receive sensory input. So again, for instance, touching the hot stove is always the classic example of taking in that sensory input into your fingertips and the nerve cells there. Your nervous system then has the second function of performing what's called integration. And what integration means is now your central nervous system, meaning your brain and that spinal cord, can sum up the input that it receives from all over the body. So you can think about integration as kind of like your brain translating what input, what sensation it just felt. The third function to finish out this kind of pattern or this pathway that we're seeing is to then generate a motor output. So again, with the classic example of touching a hot stove, your fingertips touch that hot stove, so you feel the sensation. You get that sensation input of heat and burning, which then travels to your brain for integration to tell your brain, hey, I'm getting burnt, I'm feeling something hot. And then what's the motor output? You move your hand, right? You jump your hand away from that heat. That's the motor, that's the movement response, because your brain integrated and translated the information to tell you to move that hand, okay? So 3 main functions are sensory input, integration, and motor output. Now, in the previous slide, we made mention of the central nervous system, but I want you to know that your nervous system is actually organized into 2 systems. So there's the central nervous system that we already mentioned, which is your brain and spinal cord. And then there's the peripheral nervous system. And your peripheral nervous system, also sometimes written as PNS versus your CNS. So your peripheral nervous system is all the neurons and ganglia outside of your central nervous system. So all of those nerve cells that are not part of your brain and spinal cord. Again, like I said, we're going to have a lot of recap note slides for you to jot down the information because I know that this is one of the more complicated chapters. So you can pause and write your notes. Now, I keep mentioning nervous tissues, things like terms of neurons and ganglia and neuroglia. So let's start defining these. First of all, the main functional unit of your nervous system is called the neuron. And your neurons are composed of 3 parts. Every neuron, which you see an example of a neuron here, has what's called a cell body, which is where you will find the nucleus of that cell. okay, because a neuron is a cell, right? And this neuron also, in addition to the cell body, will have what's called dendrites. So that's these extensions hanging off around that cell body. And these dendrites, what they're for is to receive signals from the sensory receptors. So these dendrites is where that input of sensory input that we mentioned before comes into the neuron, and then the cell body is where the nucleus is. And then you have the axon with axon terminals. And the axon is responsible for conducting the nerve impulse, okay, and eventually sending out a response to the next neuron or the next bit of tissue around. The axon is covered in what we call myelin sheath. So you see that term here. The myelin sheath is basically an insulator for these axons, and they're often called nerve fibers. So when you hear nerve fibers, we're usually talking about axons where you have that electrical impulse being carried out. So you can kind of picture it as information coming in through the dendrites and traveling through the cell body and across the axons to reach other tissues or cells. And here are your recap notes for the parts of the neuron. Now, when we say neuron, there's actually multiple different types of neurons as part of your nervous system, and they're usually described based on their function and shape. So the three main types of neurons are motor neurons, sensory neurons, and interneurons. And a lot of times you can kind of tell what they're doing based on their name, since I just said that a lot of times they're described or named based on what they do, their function. So first up, you have motor neurons. And whenever you hear motor, you're thinking of movement, right? So motor neurons take impulses from your central nervous system, so your brain and spinal cord, to your muscles and glands. Okay, so when you think motor, think movement, which makes you think muscles. Okay. Then you have sensory neurons, and sensory neurons are what's taking impulses from those sensory receptors, such as the classic example I keep giving you of your fingertips, to your central nervous system. Okay? And the last one that I have written here is the interneuron, and that's entirely in your CNS, and they convey pulses between various parts of the CNS. Now, I wrote them in the order that a lot of figures will show them, okay? But when you think of them, it might be easier for you to think of sensory neurons, interneurons, and then motor neurons, because that's how I like to think of them, because the sensory neurons is where they're taking impulses in from those sensory receptors. Again, it's easiest if you picture that classic example of taking the input from your fingertip neurons, feeling the heat, feeling the burning stove. Then interneurons are where your brain will translate that information. And then the motor neurons is the muscle output, that final step of actually moving your hand away. Okay, so you might find it easier to think sensory, motor neurons to remember what they do. Again, here's the recap notes for you to jot down. Now, things get a little more complicated when we start to think of nerve impulses and what's actually going on. Now, if you take courses such as Bio 150, 160, or 205, basically the anatomy and physiology courses, you'll go into this in a lot more detail because, like I said, it can get quite complicated. What I want you to know is nerve impulses are based on what we call voltage-gated channels. Now remember, in our previous lessons, we mentioned that electrolytes and ions, they can't diffuse across membranes. Okay, remember that would basically make it impossible to control their levels if they were constantly just freely diffusing across membranes. That means that to enter or exit the neuron, those ions must pass through special proteins called ion channels that are all across the membrane. Now, those ion channels, they need to be activated at a particular time in order to open and allow those ions to pass into or out of the cell, depending on what that cell needs at that moment. Now, these ion channels change structure in response to what's called voltage changes. Okay, voltage is basically, think electrical currents, it's ion changes. And because of that, they're called voltage-gated ion channels. And their job is basically to regulate the different ions inside or outside of the cell. And when we say ions, we mean things like sodium ions that are positively charged or potassium ions that are also positively charged. Now, the difference in total charge between the inside and outside of a cell is called membrane potential. Okay, so whenever you hear the term membrane potential, we're talking about the difference in charge between the inside and the outside of the cell, meaning one side of the cell will have more positive charges, for instance, and the other side will have less positive charges. So at that moment, the inside would be more positively charged versus the outside that's less positively charged. And that would be the membrane potential. Now, ultimately, neurons depend on the membrane potential of sodium and potassium ions across the membrane. So when we're talking about nerve impulses, I want you to write down dependent on sodium, which you see a lot of times as Na+, and potassium ions, which is written a lot of times as K+. Okay, so nerve impulses are based on sodium and potassium ions and their concentrations inside versus outside of that neuron cell. Okay, their membrane potential. Now, when we talk about membrane potential, there's two different potentials you'll hear. There's resting potential and there's acting potential of nerve impulses. Okay, the resting potential, what that means is it's the membrane potential, meaning the voltage, when the axon is not conducting an impulse. Okay, now we just said the membrane potential means the charge inside versus outside of that cell. So resting potential means the charge difference when the axon is not conducting an impulse. Okay, it's not conducting. This resting potential inside the neuron is usually more negative than the outside when there is no current being conducted. Okay, so when you hear resting potential, I want you to think the membrane potential when the axon is not conducting an impulse, and this resting potential has the inside of the neuron being more negative than the outside of the neuron. Okay, so it's more negative because there's less positive charges compared to the outside of the cell. Okay, they usually write it as approximately minus 65 millivolts. Okay, but you don't have to know that exact number, just know that resting potential is usually negative. Okay, negative. And the reason it's negative is due to an unequal ion concentration. And when we talk about unequal ion concentrations, again, for nerve impulses, we're just focusing on sodium and potassium ions. So in these figures, you'll usually see the inside of the neuron versus the outside, and you're looking at the concentrations of sodium versus sodium outside, potassium inside versus potassium outside. And under resting conditions, there's usually a ton more sodium outside of the cell. And if there's a lot more positive sodiums outside of the cell, that means that in comparison, the inside is considered negative, okay, because it has fewer positive charges. Reason that is that the membrane of neurons is barely permeable to sodium and the potassium gate is leaky. So more potassium gets out than sodium can get in. Okay, so if you picture this neuron, the membrane barely lets in sodium under natural regular conditions. So you're not getting much positive sodium in. And the potassium gate on the membrane is leaky, so a lot more of that potassium is constantly leaking out of the cell. So you're not getting positive entering, and you're getting a lot of positive leaving. So that's why resting conditions, you have this negative inside of the cell. Then what happens is the propagation of an action potential. So the action potential is now when a neuron is activated, when it is conducting an electric current. Okay? Now, with action potentials, we have what's called saltatory conduction, meaning you get this jumping or this traveling across the neuron of that electrical impulse, of the changes in the positive and negative charges across that membrane. Okay, again, all of this is going to be based on sodium and potassium's movement into and out of the cell. Keep in mind that conduction during an action potential, conduction means the movement of that electrical current across the neuron. Conduction is called an all or nothing event. Okay, so when I say what kind of event is conduction or an action potential, it's all or nothing. What that means is that a neuron will either fire or not fire, okay? It'll either get activated or not activated. There is no partial activation of that neuron, okay? We'll see more about that in the upcoming slides. But again, keep in mind, action potentials, conduction, I want you to write down all or nothing event. Now, as soon as you have this conduction, where you have the action potential traveling across the neuron, and you see all of a sudden certain areas have a positive charge inside the cell, that's the action potential traveling across. Okay, during an action potential, the inside of the neuron is suddenly positive. We'll go into the details in a minute. Okay, when you have this action potential moving on, there's what's called a refractory period in the previous section of the fiber where the action potential has just gone through. What that means is that sodium gates cannot open up during a refractory period. So the action potential cannot move backwards, okay? So in this slide, you can circle over here, backward. Current flow does not re-excite the previously inactive area, okay? Because the refractory period. So what refractory period means is once an action potential has moved through a particular part of the neuron, that region that's under refractory period cannot basically be reactivated at that moment. Think of it as a cooling down period. That's what a refractory period is like. So the action potential can only move in one direction. It can't go backwards because that part now is in a cooling period, a refractory period. Now, when we say action potential, what we actually mean is that you have a rapid change in polarity of that neuron across the axon's membrane. And what polarity means is charge distribution. So remember, we said all of this is based on sodium and potassium concentrations. Based on, do you have more positive ions inside the neuron or on the outside, beyond the membrane? Okay, so polarity means where your charges are distributed. So the resting potential polarity is negative inside of neuron, positive outside. Now an action potential is generated if the neuron is now receiving a stimulus from the outside that is larger than the threshold for that neuron. Okay, so they have a threshold, and once that stimulus goes boom, it detects that you have a stimulus, you get the all or nothing response. Okay? If it barely detects a stimulus, a very low level change in voltage, it's not going to activate. Okay? It has to reach a certain change in voltage before it will, boom, give you an electrical charge that will send information to your brain. Now, with polarity changes, with action potentials, you see two terms. You see depolarization and you see repolarization. Okay? We said that normally resting potential inside of a neuron is negative compared to the outside, right? You have fewer positive sodium able to come in, and you have a lot of positive potassium leaving. So you have negative inside that neuron. That's your resting potential. When the inside of the neuron now starts to become positive, that's depolarization, right? Depolarization because you're changing the resting potential. You're moving into an action potential now. So resting is negative inside, action potential is now positive inside. And when you start that action potential, when you have positive inside the neuron, that is called depolarization. It's followed by what's called repolarization, when the inside of that neuron now returns to negatively charged. This movement from negative to positive and positive to negative is all based on the gated ion channels, meaning the sodium and potassium channels along that membrane. During depolarization, when you're suddenly becoming positive, it's because, look in this picture, the sodium channels are opening. So you have a lot of positive sodium entering the cell, right? Then what happens is, what do you see? Potassium gates are open. So now what's happening? Potassium is leaving the cell. So if positive is now leaving the cell, it's once again becoming more negative inside there, okay? So positive entering the cell will make the inside positive, and we call that depolarization. And positive then leaving the cell makes the inside more negative. We call that repolarization, because it's going back to what? It's repolarizing, going back again to the resting potential, which is negative. So circle star highlight that the resting potential is negative, because that will then help you think about what happens during an action potential. If we're starting out negative, then during an action potential we'll become positive, but what do we have to do? Go back to negative at the end. Okay, that'll help you think of what depolarization and repolarization is. Now, I know this is a bit tricky, but visualizing it in a video will help it be a little bit clearer in a minute. So here's the video I just mentioned that will help you visualize what exactly is going on with neurons and their firing.
This baseball player springs into action, his nervous system rapidly processing information in a network of nerve cells, or neurons. Each neuron receives input from one or more cells. In response, the neuron may generate an electrical signal known as an action potential that travels down the length of the axon. Let's take a closer look at the plasma membrane of an axon. Even without an action potential, the axon is a busy place with many ions moving across its membrane. Much of this ion movement is driven by the sodium-potassium pump. Using energy from ATP, sodium-potassium pumps actively transport sodium ions out of the cell and potassium ions in, creating an uneven distribution of charge across the membrane. Some potassium channels are open all the time, allowing potassium ions to leave the cell. As a result of these ion movements, the inside of the cell is negative relative to the outside. This condition is called the resting potential. The membrane of an axon is also packed with gated ion channels that open and close during an action potential. At resting potential, the gated channels are closed. If a stimulus changes the distribution of charge across the membrane sufficiently, the gated sodium channels open. Movement of sodium ions across the membrane makes the inside of the cell more positive. This reversal of the charge distribution causes the gated sodium channels to close and the gated potassium channels to open. As potassium ions move out of the cell, the original charge difference is re-established across the membrane, closing the gated potassium channels. This sequence of events is called an action potential. The sodium-potassium pump restores the distribution of ions back to their previous levels at resting potential. Let's look at how the action potential is conducted along the axon. As the change in charge difference across the membrane spreads from open sodium channels, other sodium channels farther along the axon begin to open. The original sodium channels close and adjacent potassium channels open. As potassium ions move out of the cell, the original charge difference across the membrane is restored, and then the potassium channels close. Meanwhile, new sodium channels open, followed by the opening of new potassium channels and the closing of sodium channels. In this manner, the action potential is propagated along the axon of the neuron, eventually reaching another cell. The information carried by this action potential will be processed with other information, permitting this baseball player to make a spectacular catch. This baseball player springs into
Okay, so now you saw that transmission of the action potential, but now once at the end of that video, when you started to see that action potential making it to the next neuron, that's now transmission across a synapse, because that synapse is where the neurons nearly touch, where you have the axon end of one neuron almost touching the dendrites of the next neuron to transmit that information. Now, you see the term synaptic cleft. That synaptic cleft is a small gap between those two neurons, okay? So the synapse is where their two neurons are starting to meet, and the cleft is that small gap between the neurons. And what happens is you get transmission across a synapse thanks to what's called neurotransmitters. And neurotransmitters include things that you've probably heard of, like acetylcholine, norepinephrine, dopamine, serotonin, all these things that really get you moving, get you rushing, or getting you to feel different sensations such as happiness or drowsiness in some cases as well. Now, what happens is the nerve impulse that we've been talking about, that electrical current across the neurons, will now open what's called calcium channels or calcium gates. That now causes a rise in calcium ions, which are highly positively charged, and that will stimulate the synaptic vesicles, so the vesicles between the neurons, to merge with the membranes, the what we call presynaptic membrane. And you get this trigger, the release of neurotransmitters across the synaptic cleft. So you can see this in this figure. You can see that in this figure where you have the end of one neuron. So we have the axon end of one neuron. And you have these synaptic vesicles, so these little pouches holding neurotransmitters, such as acetylcholine, norepinephrine, whichever one at that moment. And that vesicle then merges with the end membrane, right? And it spits out that neurotransmitter into the synapse, that synaptic cleft, that gap, so that that neurotransmitter can then enter the next neuron, okay? And we call that the postsynaptic neuron. So there's presynaptic, postsynaptic. Presynaptic is the first neuron to have the action potential and then the nervous signal. And then postsynaptic is the one that is receiving the signal and that receives those neurotransmitters to then trigger an action potential and a response in that next neuron. So whenever you see synapse and synaptic cleft, that's where you get the transfer of information from one neuron to its neighboring neuron, and it's done through neurotransmitters. You'll also hear the term synaptic integration, and what that basically means is each individual neuron is usually receiving many different signals at one time. So it's getting, a lot of excitatory and inhibitory signals all at once from neighboring neurons. And what they have to do is synaptic integration, meaning it has to sum up those excitatory and inhibitory signals to really figure out what it's now supposed to do. Okay, so that's enough of the action potentials and signal transmission. I know that's a lot of material, kind of complex, so make sure to try and watch that part of the video a couple of times, really sit with that information. Now, the rest of this lecture focuses on a lot of just terminology. So we've mentioned the central nervous system quite a few times already. Whenever you hear CNS, or central nervous system, that means your spinal cord and your brain. And both of these structures are protected by bone. Your spinal cord is protected by your spine, and your brain is protected by your skull. Now, in addition to the protective bone, they also have 3 protective membranes called meninges. Okay, so it's written right there. And these layers of meninges are known as the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. So you see those terms here, dura mater, pia mater, arachnoid mater. Okay. The dura mater is basically the outermost layer, and in Latin that means hard mother because it's for protecting the brain and the spinal cord as the outermost meninges. The middle layer is then the arachnoid mater, and then the pia mater, that is soft mother in Latin. And the reason why it's soft mother is that's directly contacting and covering that soft brain and spinal cord. It's basically, the textbooks like to call it like plastic wrap around the brain and spinal cord. Whereas the dura mater, that's the outermost meninges for protection. Now, when you think of the spinal cord and the brain, I want you to know what their functions are. So the spinal cord, that's your center for a lot of your reflexes, your reflex actions. And that's because it's basically the communication point between your brain and your spinal nerves. Whereas the brain, when you think of the brain, that's your big control center. That's really what's translating all the messages. Now, we keep saying brain, but I want you to remember that the brain is actually made up of many different parts. First up, you have your cerebrum. Cerebrum, and you hear cerebral a lot. If you're cerebral, you're quite the thinker, right? Your cerebrum is the largest portion of your brain, and that's what's going to be responsible for communicating with and all the other parts of the brain and kind of coordinating the brain. Your cerebrum is split into a left and right hemisphere because remember we said that you have bilateral symmetry. So there's a center line with a left and a right because of bilateral symmetry. Now what's important is this structure here, your corpus callosum. That's important because that connects the 2 hemispheres of your brain and allows information to be passed from one side of the other, because that would really suck if you had all this information going to one side of the brain but the second side was just left in the dark. It didn't know what was going on. So you have the corpus callosum to communicate between the 2 halves of your brain. You also have what's called the cerebral cortex, and that's the outer layer of gray matter, basically covering up the hemispheres, both the left and right side of your cerebrum. And that's very important because your cerebral cortex contains a whole bunch of motor, sensory, and association areas. And again, when you hear motor and sensory, think of motor as you're actually moving and movement and muscles, whereas sensory is taking input, taking in information from your outer environment. Now, I also point out on this slide that the rest of your cerebrum is made up of white matter mixed with gray basal nuclei, and that's a fancy way of saying it's an integration center for motor commands. So when you hear basal nuclei, it simply means an integration center for motor movement commands. Again, here's a recap slide for you to pause and jot down your notes. Now, like I said, this is going to be a lot of terminology. The brain has many different parts. In addition to the cerebrum, you'll also hear diencephalon. And your diencephalon is the part of your brain containing your hypothalamus and your thalamus. Now, your hypothalamus, whenever you see hypothalamus, underline the H and write homeostasis. So your hypothalamus helps maintain your homeostasis, meaning the balance, the equilibrium in your body, and it controls the pituitary gland. So it basically serves as a link between your nervous and your endocrine systems. Your thalamus, on the other hand, is thought of as the gatekeeper. It's the gatekeeper for sensory info that's going to try and make its way to the cortex. Lastly, we have the pineal gland, and we've mentioned your pineal gland before. What that does is it secretes melatonin, and melatonin, again, is a hormone responsible for controlling your daily sleep-wake rhythms. And again, like I've said before, try not to take melatonin supplements because that will then mess up your pineal gland's ability to properly secrete its own melatonin. Okay, recap notes, because again, like I said, this is just going to be a lot of terminology and definitions. Continuing on with other important parts of your brain, you have your cerebellum, your brainstem, and your medulla oblongata. So the cerebellum, what that's responsible for is basically a central point for signals that we've been talking about so far. So your cerebellum, it receives sensory input specifically from your eyes, your ears, your joints and muscles, and then it sends out the motor impulses out the brainstem to your skeletal muscles to respond to the input that it's taking in. So for instance, if your sensory input from your eyes detects something scary, like a giant bear coming your way or a huge cheetah running towards you. And I mean cheetah like the animal, not like what we have in some of our classes. So anyway, your eyes detects this scary predator charging towards you. That sensory input will then be treated in the cerebellum to send out the motor impulse to your skeletal muscles to do what? Run as fast as you can to get away from that. Okay, so cerebellum is involved in receiving sensory input and then sending out the motor impulses to your skeleton muscles. You also have your brainstem, and the brainstem, as you can see here, is made up of your midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. So when you think of these structures as the brainstem, basically know that this area will house your reflex center and will be a relay center for the various messages coming in and out of your brain. Okay, so like we mentioned, the cerebellum sends its impulses to that brainstem to then tell the skeletal muscles how to respond, what reflex to activate. And I also want to point out, even though we just mentioned what the brainstem does, I want to specifically highlight this guy here that's part of the brainstem, your medulla oblongata, because what that does is it's responsible for many different reflexes that you might not even think of. A lot of students, when I say reflex, they think of, the classic, you see a doctor gently tap the kneecap and boom, the leg jumps up. That's the reflex they think of. We're not talking about that. We're talking about your real important reflexes like heartbeat, breathing, vomiting, coughing. All four of those things are reflexes for your body. Think about it. If you get something lodged in your throat, what do you reflexively do? You start coughing, right? That's thanks to your medulla oblongata. Just the fact that right now your heart is beating and you are breathing without thinking about it because it's a reflex, that is importantly controlled by your medulla oblongata, getting signals and putting signals out. Again, recap to help you jot down those notes. And yes, there are still more parts of the brain to cover. You have the reticular activating system and the limbic system. And my personal favorite is the limbic system because I just find it so fascinating what your brain can do to you. So first up, the reticular activating system is hopefully very active in you right now because that system causes people to be alert. So when you're alert, it means your reticular activating system is very active. Your limbic system, on the other hand, that's a very fascinating part of your brain because it's involved in higher mental functions, but also primitive emotions. So limbic system is involved in mental function and primitive emotions, meaning it's involved in regulating your emotions as well as the various behaviors related to these emotions, things like fear and motivation, but it also plays a big role in your learning and memory. And it includes parts like thalamus, hypothalamus, and hippocampus, as well as the amygdala. And so for the hippocampus and the amygdala, I want you to circle, highlight those. They're essential for learning and memory. Okay? And the difference between these terms is memory is the ability to hold on to something that occurred in the past, whereas learning occurs when we actually retain and use those past memories. So again, memory is just the passive action of holding on to something from the past, whereas learning is when you actually build and use those previous memories. Now, like I said, your limbic system, in addition to learning memory, is also involved in feeling emotions, and that's going to be very important when we talk in later chapters about your senses, because some of your senses, like smell for instance, are associated with your limbic system. They put signals into your limbic system so you can trigger emotions based on sensory input. And that'll be interesting when we talk about it in later lessons. Again, here's your recap note emphasizing what each of these systems are for. Make sure with all the terms we discussed today as parts of the brain, you have to know the function. So I could describe a particular function being used or being, occurring, and you should be able to tell me, oh, that's done by the limbic system, or that's done by the cerebellum. Now that was all the central nervous system. All those parts of the brain are part of your CNS, your central nervous system. You also have your peripheral nervous system, which is called your PNS, and that is broken down into your somatic system and your autonomic system. And when we say somatic system, we mean your cranial nerves and your spinal nerves. And these are important because this system serves your skin, your joints, your skeletal muscles, which means it allows you to do things like your voluntary control of skeletal muscles, your movement of your limbs, for instance. That's your somatic system of your peripheral nervous system. It is also responsible for the purpose of involuntary control of the reflex arc. Okay, so in that reflex arc, your spinal cord is basically controlling what will happen when you have sensory input coming in and then the movement, the muscle to be moved as an output. You also have your autonomic system, and your autonomic system, that is basically what will control your smooth muscles, your cardiac muscles, your glands. It's going to be controlling things that you are not conscious of at all. So this will all be involuntary, not conscious. And it's broken down into what's called the sympathetic autonomic nervous system and the parasympathetic system. So sympathetic, I want you to remember, that is your fight or flight response, which we've mentioned that term before. So fight or flight is when you undergo stress and you need to act quickly without even thinking about it. That's why it's autonomic. You can think autonomic, automatic. And your parasympathetic is your relaxed state, your housekeeper functions. Basically, when you are not in stress and your body simply has to keep your heart beating, keep you breathing. Okay, so it's working alongside the structures that we mentioned in your brain also for regulating those natural reflexes. And some recap notes for you to pause and jot down. This is just a visual to help you see the various nerves and the connections that they will make, the different systems that they can help regulate. Okay, things like, stimulating whether you urinate or whether you can hold it in. Things like stimulation of your breathing, of your lungs, or the heart rate speeding up or slowing down. Just to help you visualize. But again, when you see a slide like this, you don't have to memorize all of those parts of the slide. It's just to help you visualize. This is just a quick summary of the various parts of PNS, your peripheral nervous system. Again, breaking down the autonomic side into sympathetic and parasympathetic. Now, the last thing I want to mention with the last few minutes that we have left is what happens when the nervous system goes wrong. There are a lot of different diseases that you can be hit with. Some are more severe than others, and keep in mind the ones that I mentioned on this slide and the next slide, they are just a small sampling of the diseases that can hit your nervous system. There are many, many more. It would take hours and hours, days and days to go through them all. So just as a sampling, when you hear neurodegenerative disorders, those are any of the diseases or illnesses that are basically characterized by losing some nervous system function, a lot of times gradually, and they worsen over time as more and more neurons die in these disorders. The two big examples are Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's. So Alzheimer's disease, that's basically the most common cause of dementia in the elderly. So if you've ever known an elderly patient or an elderly loved one who starts to have this gradual memory loss, they get confused about where they are, about what time period it can even be. They might be calling you by names of other loved ones. Perhaps if you're their grandchild, for instance, they may be calling you by their child's name, perhaps one of your parents, because they're confused about what time they're in, what year they're in, who they're talking to. They end up having difficulty with any kind of planning and tasks, and basically you see dramatic personality changes. So I even remember with my great-grandmother, she was the sweetest of people, and then when dementia hit, all of a sudden she became very belligerent to certain people, very angry and cursing, things she never did when her brain function was normal. But basically what happens in people with Alzheimer's disease and forms of dementia, they have a lot of neurons dying, and it's usually associated with abnormal clumps that they call amyloid plaques. So whenever you hear amyloid plaques, think of Alzheimer's disease. It's basically you get plaques and tangled brain fibers all over the place, and even shrinking brain volume. And you'll hear proteins associated with it like tau and APOE, because they're doing more and more research to try and figure these things out. But ultimately, they have still yet to find any cure. There's no cure for Alzheimer's disease, and there's no cure for Parkinson's disease either. And Parkinson's is another neurodegenerative disease, gets worse over time. And this one, the neurons that are dying or getting destroyed are specifically dopamine neurons, okay? And what happens is the midbrain structure of their brain that's supposed to regulate movement, the neurons in there start gradually dying, and these people unfortunately get horrible symptoms of tremors. They cannot control the shaking of their limbs, of their fingers. They start getting very slow and slurred speech. They can have balance or posture problems, so you might see them walking through hallways looking very bent over, even limping. You might think that they have retained a physical injury, but it's actually because of the loss of neurons and improper ability to regulate their movement anymore. And again, there's no cure for this one as well. Now, in addition to neurodegenerative disorders, which is the gradual loss of neurons and death of neurons, there's also neurodevelopmental disorders, and that's when there's a problem in terms of the development of the nervous system. Two big examples are autism and ADHD, and we won't go into the details because there's so much, in terms of research and characterization still going on. But autism is basically a neurodevelopmental disorder characterized by impaired social interactions and a lot of times impaired communication abilities. So for instance, a child may start to learn how to speak, and then all of a sudden the next year you notice that child is no longer speaking, even though they had previously done so before. And they'll have trouble maintaining eye contact and whatnot. But there's a big spectrum of autism and related neurodevelopmental disorders, so not every individual will be the same. There's also ADHD, and that one is characterized by difficulty maintaining attention and difficulty controlling impulses. Again, these are both things that are being studied more and more, and as we learn more, we can help better treat the people dealing with these issues. There's also mental illnesses, and when you hear mental illnesses, these are now the nervous system disorders that end up resulting in major problems, not only with thinking, but also with your mood and even relating with other people. And two big ones are schizophrenia and depression. And with schizophrenia, this is usually characterized by the inability to actively perceive reality, meaning that a lot of these patients end up having not only trouble thinking clearly, but they have full-blown delusions and hallucinations that can be very, very scary and can affect how they interact with others and with their environment, because they're seeing things that are not there. And a lot of times it has a lot of paranoia associated with it as well. And the last one on this slide is major depression. And I know a lot of people think of depression as just feeling sad, but it's so much more than that. Patients having depression, they fight with so many other symptoms. It can be a loss of, that enjoyment that you had with activities that used to make you so happy but don't anymore. But it can also affect things like appetite, like sleep, how you think even. It could be so difficult for these patients to concentrate, and they'll end up having a lot of feelings of worthlessness, of helplessness, and unfortunately even suicidal thoughts in some cases. So please don't take depression lightly. Understand that a lot of people do suffer from it in varying degrees, and that it is a real illness, and that there are ways to get help because it is a true illness. And here's a recap in case you missed any of those notes, since that was a lot of information on the previous slide. The last two issues with your nervous system that I want to mention are epilepsy and stroke, terms I'm sure you have all heard, but you may not have known exactly what they were in reference to. There are actually many different types of epilepsy, but as I'm sure you have probably seen or heard, they are all always associated with or characterized by having recurrent seizures. And a lot of times epilepsy is actually a symptom of some other problem, such as a brain injury or disease or another issue that they just may not have found yet for that person. And in some cases, they may never end up identifying the exact cause, and instead what they simply do is have the patient take anticonvulsants. It basically suppresses the rapid firing of the neurons that are causing those seizures. And these anticonvulsives are actually also used a lot in bipolar disorders and various mental illnesses, such as borderline personality. So sometimes when they come up with a treatment to target one issue, they end up helping people with various other issues as well. So for epilepsy, think of recurrent seizures. And stroke is what happens when basically your blood fails to reach any particular part of your brain. And when your blood fails to reach a part of your brain, you now lack oxygen in that area. And that'll end up causing the neurons in that part of the brain to die. And this neuronal death, or those death of neurons, can basically cause a lot of different symptoms. Some of the big ones that you see are partial paralysis and like drooping of certain facial structures or certain limbs. You'll see speech disturbances as well, a lot of times a slurred kind of difficulty speaking, and even things like sensory problems or memory loss. And a lot of times a stroke ends up being caused by blood clots or a bursting of a weak blood vessel in your brain. And there are a lot of different risk factors that can kind of increase your chances of getting a stroke. These include things like high blood pressure, diabetes, high cholesterol, or even genetics if your family has a history of a lot of strokes. I also want to point out that smoking doubles the risk of stroke. So do not smoke. And I know a lot of times people are like, oh, no, I don't smoke. I just vape, or I just use pot occasionally. And when those people say that, they don't realize that those forms of smoking also increase your risk of stroke. Those forms of smoking also increase issues with your lungs. So simply just vaping or just using a little pot every once in a while, they are bad, and they cause a lot of complications that I go into more detail in courses like microbiology. But yeah, just know they're bad. Say no to drugs of any kind, okay? So now, that brings us to the end of this lesson. So with this, if you have any questions, as always, send me a message in Remind app, and just never hesitate. Anytime, day or night, any questions, I will help you. Like I said, I know this is a complicated chapter, so make sure to rewatch parts of the videos or to pause to take the time to jot down your notes. Okay? Thank you, and have a wonderful day.